You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. My co-host today is Michelle Jewel Shaw, teacher, photographer, and chairperson of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Jeremy, and hello to all of our listeners out there.
Today is May 8th, 2022, and this is episode 172 of Lighthearted. In a few minutes, we'll hear an interview with Shannon King, curator for the Fort Rod Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse National Historic Site in British Columbia, Canada. So, Michelle, we're recording this on May 2nd, and yesterday we both attended the American Lighthouse Foundation's gala dinner, which was pretty cool. We hadn't had it in a couple of years, so that was nice. How did you like it, Michelle?
I love the event. I had a great time, and it was really great to see all of the lighthouse enthusiasts that we haven't had an opportunity to see for the last couple of years. And I would also like to congratulate you, Jeremy, on receiving the 2021 Led Hadley Award for all of your volunteerism that you do for Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. I don't know what we would do as an organization without you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate that. You know, I think you'd agree. I mean, you won the award of was it about three years ago, 4 years ago?
The last time. Yep.
The last time we had the live event. Yeah. So I think you'd agree with me that we do this stuff, this volunteering for lighthouses, because we love them.
Absolutely.
And we want to preserve them, and we want to, let people know about them and everything. We don't do it to win awards, but it's always nice to be recognized for
Absolutely.
the hard work you do. So
yep.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And as I said in the event, it was nice to see people in person, people sitting there looking at me instead of little faces on a computer screen,
right.
Little Zoom boxes. So yeah, it was really nice.
Yeah, that was definitely nice.
Yeah. And I just want to clear something up, to make something clear for listeners, because I think there's often confusion. People tend to get the U.S. Lighthouse Society and the American Lighthouse Foundation confused. Of course, we do this podcast for the U.S. Lighthouse Society, but I'm also president of the board of directors of the American Lighthouse Foundation, and I've been involved with ALF since the 90s. And I also, of course, I'm very involved with our chapter of the American Lighthouse Foundation, Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. So I just want to make it clear that the U.S. Lighthouse Society and the American Lighthouse Foundation are two different organizations, but they both do a tremendous amount for lighthouse preservation and education.
Definitely.
Yeah. And of course, you're the chairperson of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses, Michelle. And we
Yes.
have some things coming up, including an event on June 4th, which is creeping up on us. It's going to be at the Lions Club in Kittery, Maine.
That's right. We are having the June Jamboree. We'll have some fun entertainment and food at the event and a silent auction and raffle. It's one of the ways we're raising the money to rebuild the wooden walkway at Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse.
Yeah, the 80-foot walkway that reaches out to the lighthouse, which is, of course, in Newcastle, New Hampshire, was last rebuilt in 2006. It's taken a beating in storms. It's going to cost more than $30,000 to rebuild. People can find out more about the June Jamboree on June 4th by going to portsmouthharborlighthouse.org.
If anyone has a lighthouse-related item or gift certificates they'd like to donate to the event, they should contact us at info@portsmouthharborlighthouse.org. We're also starting up our tours by appointment at Portsmouth Harbor Light at the end of this month, and we have 2 Lighthouse Sunset cruises coming up on June 17th and 24th.
It seems like it's been the off season for a long time, and suddenly the season's
it's here,
right almost upon us. It is here. Yeah. So things are heating up. We're getting into the busy lighthouse season in New England. And let me ask you, Michelle, has anything interesting happened on this date in lighthouse history?
Why, yes, it has, Jeremy. The Port Washington Lighthouse in Wisconsin was first lighted on May 8th, 1849. Because the Port Washington area was home to many immigrants from Luxembourg, in 2000, the country of Luxembourg paid for a new tower to be installed as part of a restoration. The lighthouse stands as a memorial to members of the United States military who fought in Luxembourg in World War II, and the restored lighthouse contains a museum of the light station's history.
Yeah, that's a great story. So let's tell our listeners about today's guest, Shannon King.
Sure, Jeremy. The island known as Fisgard is a stone's throw offshore at the west side of the entrance to Esquimalt Harbor. The island was named for a British naval frigate, with the name's origin reaching back to Fisgard, a coastal town in Wales. The British Royal Navy began using Esquimalt Harbor as a base for its operations in Pacific Canada in 1848.
The lighthouse at Fisgard went into service on November 16, 1860. The 48-foot round brick tower was surmounted by an iron lantern holding a fourth-order Fresnel lens that rotated on a mercury bed. The ornate iron spiral stairway inside the tower was crafted in San Francisco.
The first keeper was George Davies, a native of Wales. George Davies left Fisgard and became keeper at Race Rocks in February 1861.
The light was automated in early 1929 with the installation of a acetylene-powered lamp and sun valve. Fisgard ceased being an island in 1951 with the creation of a causeway from Fort Rod Hill. The lighthouse was designated a National Historic Site of Canada several years later.
Parks Canada completed much renovation of the station in the 1970s and 1980s, including the reconstruction of a boathouse and a storehouse, and the keeper's dwelling was converted into a museum. With the adjacent fort, the site is now operated as the Fort Rod Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse National Historic Site.
Shannon King is the curator for the Fort Rod Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse National Historic Site. I had the pleasure of speaking with her recently. Let's listen to that conversation now. I am speaking today with Shannon King, who's the curator for the Fort Rod Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse National Historic Site in British Columbia, Canada. I have such great memories of visiting there in 2015. Thank you so much for joining me today, Shannon.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your podcast. So before we get into the questions, actually, I'd like to acknowledge that Fort Rod Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse National Historic Sites are located on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people. They're the First Nations of the area, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nations. And their historical relationships with the land extend back a lot farther than the history we're going to be talking about today. In fact, thousands of years. And I'm just really grateful to live and learn on this territory.
I'm really glad you started by making that point. I think that is so important that we include that in anything we discuss about the area. So I really appreciate you mentioning that. Thank you. Before we get more into the history of the site there, the lighthouse, and we'll talk a little bit about the fort too, how did you come to be the curator at Fort Rod Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse?
Well, actually, I've only been here a few months, so I'm still learning a lot and enjoying that process of getting into the stories. But I've been working in museums for about 18 years, both in educational and curatorial roles. And I come to this position with a master's degree in archaeology from Simon Fraser University in 2007. And it's just a wonderful opportunity to get into the museum scene in Victoria.
Yeah. And what exactly does your job as curator entail?
Well, I work for Parks Canada, and Parks Canada has a mandate to preserve nationally significant places and to present the stories of these places so that visitors can experience and understand Canada's history and natural spaces. And so my job supports this by caring for a collection of artifacts that are stored on site. And my job is to make sure that they're preserved for future generations, but also to provide access to that collection for people today who may want to do some research, so research requests, and also by creating temporary exhibits that share stories that aren't permanently on display when you come to the sites.
Now, I want to ask you about the harbor there. And before we started the interview here, I had to ask you about the pronunciation. So I hope I get it right here. But Fisgard Lighthouse is at the entrance to Esquimalt Harbor. And what makes that harbor historically significant?
Yeah, you got it right. The harbor is just geographically, naturally a well-protected harbor and has been important to the Esquimalt and Songhees people for at least 4,000 years before Europeans arrived. And so historically, it's significant in that way. It continues to be important to both nations and all of their relations today. But probably you're referring a little bit more recent history. 1848 is when the colonial naval history of Esquimalt Harbor begins. And the harbor was used by the Imperial Navy and visited by warships of the British Pacific Squadron in their efforts to protect British interests in this area. So the harbor has been used continuously since then as a naval base, first by the British, and then after 1906, it's been used by the Canadian Navy.
I think you partially explained this already in what you just said, but what was the impetus for building Fisgard Lighthouse as the first permanent lighthouse on the west coast of Canada?
Yeah, you're right. There's a few reasons. Obviously, the British Imperial Navy occupying the harbor was an important one. The light was there to guide ships into the harbor after dark. But there was also some other things happening locally, and one of them was that gold was discovered in the Fraser River in 1858, and about 30,000 gold miners flooded into Victoria within a couple of months during the spring of 1858 to get their permits before heading to the mainland to find their gold. And so this increased naval traffic, obviously, hugely, and not just bringing the miners to Victoria, but also all the other trade and commerce that met the demands of this rapid growth. And so that was one of the reasons why some lights were important on the side of the Juan de Fuca Strait. But there's another reason that it was really important, and that is because a lot of those gold seekers were American. And Vancouver Island was a British colony at the time. And so the British were pretty motivated to establish their presence on this side of the Juan de Fuca Strait.
So it's a beautiful lighthouse, very elegant, I would say, stately, and the beautiful keeper's house too. Do we know anything about the architect who designed the lighthouse? Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, the design of the lighthouse was likely influenced by a few different people. One of them was Joseph Pemberton, who was the colonial surveyor and engineer of Vancouver Island at the time. He was asked by Governor Douglas to prepare some drawings and specifications for the lighthouse. So whether he did that himself or whether he got Otto Tiedemann to do it, I'm not sure, but Tiedemann worked with Pemberton at the surveyor's office. So he was part of the team to ensure the building was constructed to plan. So probably it was an influence of both of those folks. But we also know that John Wright was involved, and he was the first professional architect in Victoria, and he won the contract to build the lighthouse. So I don't know how much he influenced the plans, but we do know for sure that one of the features of Fisgard Lighthouse is directly attributed to John Wright, and that's the staircase, which is a circular cast iron, really beautiful, actually, beautiful staircase that's perfectly fitted to the tower, and it was cast in San Francisco.
Ah, yeah. Oh, it is. I remember that beautiful stairway. But certainly it's, I would say it's the whole site there, the lighthouse and keeper's house and the beautiful location. It's one of the icons of the British Columbia coast. I think you'd agree with that.
I would agree with that.
The first keeper at Fisgard was George Davies, who traveled from Wales to become the first lighthouse keeper on Canada's west coast, British Columbia. Was there any reaction of local people to the government's choice of a keeper at that time?
I don't really know how the locals felt about it, actually, but what I do know is that Governor Douglas requested competent men to accompany the light equipment from England because, of course, there weren't any experienced light keepers in the colony at the time. And so the Board of Trade chose men who could oversee the installation of the equipment and also stay on as light keepers. And so they actually chose somebody who had been employed by the company that produced the brass frames and set the glass lenses into them, and also produced the lanterns for the two lighthouses, both Fisgard Lighthouse and Race Rocks Lighthouse, that were being built at the same time. So George Davies had been employed by Wilkinson Company, and that's why he was hired to supervise the installation of the lights. He and his family, he has had 3 kids at the time, but actually only 2 of them came with him. One was too ill to travel. But he and his wife and 2 kids came and were the first keepers of the light at Fisgard.
So I understand, first of all, I think that first lens was a 4th order Fresnel lens, which is a fairly common size. I'm sure it was incredibly beautiful. I understand there were some problems getting that lens shipped from England to Canada before the light could go into service. Can you tell me anything about that?
Well, from what I've learned, I think the ruby shades were the real trouble, but both I think the lantern and the shades were damaged in the journey to Fisgard. When the vessel stopped in Honolulu, I think what they discovered is that the ruby shades in one of the cases were all broken, and that the ironwork of the lantern was also quite rusted already from exposure on the journey. So for sure the shades would have been replaced at that time, but in 1865, we also know that the shades were ordered again. And when those shades arrived in February, it turned out that they were all broken. And so new ones were shipped in August. And at that time, in 1865, they made them into from two pieces of thicker glass to better withstand transit. So it sounds like the ruby shades were the trouble.
When you say ruby shades, it's probably a system that rotated around the lens to create a flash. Do you know anything about that? Or
my understanding, and it's limited, but my understanding is that the shades would be so that the light would shine different colors in different angles. So there was actually a portion of it that shone green, a portion that shone white, and a portion that was red.
okay.
And so that would help with the navigation to know which angle you were coming at the light from.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
You know what I mean? Like when you're navigating on the water, you need to be able to see. So rather than it all being white, it would be clearer where to navigate based on what color you could see.
That makes a lot of sense. In the US, we sometimes refer to light as a sector light, where there might be a red sector, we would call it, that marks a dangerous area. So
I think that's exactly it.
So mariners coming in the channel, if they veer out of the channel and see that red sector, they know they got to get back in the channel. So there was a keeper by the name of Joseph Dare in the late 1800s, who, from what I read about him, he had quite a bit of bad luck in his career as a lighthouse keeper. Can you tell me about him?
Sure. Joseph Dare was the lightkeeper from 1884 to 1898, and he injured himself actually in 1890 when he shot at a mink that was on the rocks at Fisgard, on Fisgard Island, and his gun exploded.
Mm-hmm.
So it was actually quite a serious injury, and he spent about 3.5 months in the Naval Hospital at Esquimalt. And at that time, it was the responsibility of the lightkeeper to find their own replacement. And there was no additional budget to pay the substitute. So the substitute was paid out of the keeper's own salary. And so Dare didn't have a salary while he was in the hospital, and apparently had some problems paying his hospital bill.
But I understand he had even worse luck a little bit later on. Is that right?
Indeed. He passed away on July 3rd, 1898. Apparently he was returning to the lighthouse from Esquimalt after dark and lost an oar and drowned trying to retrieve it. So yeah, his luck did not improve.
Wow, that's a pretty sad lightkeeping career there. Are there any other particular stories about lighthouse keepers and families who lived at Fisgard that stand out for you?
For sure. I really like the stories or what I've learned about the Bevis family. So William Bevis was lightkeeper for 18 years, starting in 1861 to 1879. And we actually have quite a lot of correspondence from him, not so much about his family life, but mostly advocating for repairs to improve the living conditions at Fisgard. So when Fisgard Lighthouse was first constructed, there was an article in the local paper called The Colonist, which mentioned that the work and material are both of substantial character, particularly the tower, which will endure for a century without any serious injury. But it turns out that the hard brick that they thought they were building the tower with was actually not as hard, a bit of an inferior quality brick. And within a short period of time, the exterior of the buildings began to deteriorate and require significant repairs. So William Bevis wrote several letters about these conditions, starting as early as April 1861, just 6 months after the lighthouse was first lit. So the fittings around the windows and doors were loose. The lighthouse was drafty. rain would come in through the windows and doors during the storms. And so he found that the interior was damp and uncomfortable. And he wasn't taken very seriously at the time. There's actually a letter back that suggests he do more work as a lightkeeper and less letter writing. But in fact, records show that quite a bit of repair work was needed between 1861 and 1873.
Reminds me of the troubles we had with a lot of our earlier lighthouses in the U.S. that weren't built so well until a little bit later in the 1800s. They started building them better.
The other interesting thing about the Bevis family is that when William Bevis passed away, his wife Amelia and her 19-year-old niece became the keepers of the light for 6 months. From August 1879 to February 1880, while they were awaiting a replacement keeper. So they weren't technically light keepers, they were still assistants, but it was the first time that an all-female team operated the light as the main light keepers. It was just that they weren't considered light keepers because women weren't permitted to hold that post at the time, but they certainly did the job.
Well, that's really interesting. Were there other women keepers in the history of Fisgard, do you know?
The very first family, George Davies, we talked about him a little bit, and he transferred to Race Rocks in 1861, and his wife didn't follow for a couple of months. So she was at Fisgard as an assistant keeper with a couple of other gentlemen for 2 months before she also transferred to Race Rocks. So technically, she was also operated the light. I don't think there were other women keepers because the last keeper was in 1928.
Right.
I'm pretty sure the rest of the keepers were men.
Yeah. So the last keeper and family left there in 1928, as you said. Can we talk a bit about the historic site? The Fort Rod Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse National Historic Site was established. Can you tell me, one, how that came about, and two, what does the historic site encompass?
Yeah, the lighthouse was designated a National Historic Site in 1958, and shortly afterwards, Parks Canada assumed responsibility for site operations. So there's actually two National Historic Sites side by side that are separate. They have different heritage values and stories, but they are both operated by Parks Canada, and that's Fort Rod Hill as well as Fisgard Lighthouse. The Fisgard Lighthouse is considered significant for some of the reasons we've already talked about, that it's the earliest lighthouse built on Canada's west coast, that it guided vessels into Esquimalt Harbor, which was the base for the Royal Navy at the time when it was built, and also that it was a visual marker of British sovereignty in the area. But it also influenced the establishment of the Victoria Esquimalt coastal defenses, and that's really where the other site comes in. So today, you can walk out onto Fisgard Island with a causeway that was built in the 1950s. And so you can actually go out and explore Fisgard Island, walk around the lighthouse, and go into the lighthouse. And I really enjoy that part of the experience of walking out on that causeway, because that causeway wasn't there when there was a lightkeeper. And now it's really easy to access the site, but you can really imagine without that causeway what it would have been like for the lightkeepers to live on the island. Even though the land is really close physically, it would have been quite a barrier at the time for the lightkeepers. And so their world was pretty small on Fisgard Island. It's a fairly small rocky island. There's not a lot of vegetation. So it really gives you that sense of isolation when you come to visit this site. But in terms of the experience when you go, being on the island is one part of that, but the other part is going inside the buildings. And in 2010, Parks Canada installed a variety of exhibits inside the lighthouse. And so when you first enter the building, you get a sense of what it might have been like to be a lightkeeper back in the 1800s, because the first room is decorated as it might have been when Amelia Bevis was busy cooking on the stove to feed her family. So it's sort of set up like a simple kitchen. But the other rooms share a lot more stories about lighthouse technology and naval wayfinding and how that's changed over time. And you also can go in and see that original cast iron staircase we talked about that came from San Francisco. So I think it's pretty neat to be able to go inside the lighthouse and really explore and think about what it might have been like to live there.
Oh, absolutely. I was very impressed by the way it was presented when I was there in 2015. It's really, really nicely done. It's a great place to visit. And talking about how it's on that island that's a little bit offshore with the causeway to it now, a good analogy or a good comparison for our listeners might be the famous Nubble Lighthouse in York, Maine, and southern Maine. That's one of the most photographed lighthouses in the world. That's just a couple of 100 feet offshore on an island. And they talked about building a bridge out to it over the years, but they never did. So the public doesn't get to go on the island. And it wasn't always that easy to go back and forth. The caretaker there now is a good friend of mine, and he's had his boat accidents going back and forth because it's close, but it can be tricky, as you well know. The sea can be quite treacherous. So again, you've also got the fort there, Fort Rod Hill. I don't know if you want to say anything more about what visitors experience when they visit there, including the fort itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the lighthouse, but in order to visit the lighthouse, in order to actually physically get to the lighthouse, you walk through the other National Historic Site, which is Fort Rod Hill. And starting in the late 19th century, there was a whole series of fortifications built around the shores of Greater Victoria, which served as observation posts and emplacements for garrison artillery that were designed to combat naval threats, to protect not only the community during wartime, but also specifically the West Coast home of the British Navy and later on the Canadian Navy in Esquimalt Harbor. And so Fort Rod Hill is one of those places. And most of the locations were decommissioned in the late 1950s. And Fort Rod Hill was chosen as the site to represent this history of the Victoria Esquimalt coastal defense system. And that's why Fort Rod Hill was designated a National Historic Site. So the fort itself consists of several artillery emplacements, batteries, barracks, canteen, magazines. There's a lot of buildings to explore. And the fort shares stories about artillery and technology from the 1890s through World War II. There was never any active battle against any enemy at this site, but the fort was ready for such an eventuality during World War I and World War II. But also throughout its history, it was an important location for training. And so there was a lot of activity in that sense of training and drills using some of these large artillery. That's when you really understand the impact of having a lighthouse so close to a fort, and that is that the percussion from firing these large artillery damaged the glass in the lantern on more than one occasion. And so custom metal shades were made that had to be installed before firing practice in order to protect the lantern. So although they're separate, there is definitely some connections.
Yeah. Well, we've had similar stories at some of the sites in the U.S. that have both forts and lighthouses next to each other, including my local one here, Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse, being right next to Fort Constitution. I know there was extremely similar friction there between the two parts of it. But anyway, let me ask you, what is the open season for the lighthouse?
Yeah, for sure. The grounds are open daily, year-round from 10 to 4. And then the site has a peak season when the buildings are open daily from May 1st to October 15th from 10 to 5. And the site offers daily programming during that peak season, often by costumed interpreters. And outside of the peak season, the lighthouse and other buildings are open to visit on the weekends. But it's always a beautiful place to go for a walk. It's a very park-like setting all year round.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I remember the beautiful walk to the lighthouse when I was there. Could you remind me, first of all, how long is that walk from the parking area?
Sure. It takes about 15 minutes to walk down to the lighthouse from the parking area. So it's a gentle slope. You have to go down to the shoreline. And the nice thing about it is that there's a lot of things to see along the way, benches to sit at, but also several buildings to go in and explore. And many of those have exhibits inside from May to October. So lots of things to see and do, and sort of a nice meander, not necessarily a fast walk from parking lot to to the lighthouse.
Yeah, I remember I spent a good part of a day there and on a beautiful day and thoroughly enjoyed it all. The walk goes through something called the Gary Oak Learning Meadow. What is that exactly?
Yeah, I think this is a great example of how Parks Canada is partnering with Indigenous communities to educate people about the different uses of the land over time. So it isn't just a fort or a lighthouse, but really looking at how this land was used before the built environment on it now. And it's also an example of how Parks Canada is working to preserve endangered ecosystems in Canada. So Gary Oak ecosystems are actually extremely rare in Canada. They only exist in a few places in southern British Columbia. At Fort Rod Hill, the Gary Oak Learning Meadow is a 1 acre of space that used to be lawn, but has been cultivated now to bring back the species that live within a Gary Oak ecosystem, to educate visitors about the diversity and importance of this ecosystem, but also to provide a space for species at risk. And on a cultural level, this area of the site shares information about the Indigenous connections to this land. And Gary Oak Meadows were and are very important to local Indigenous communities who cared for the ecosystems and relied on them for their biodiversity long before Europeans were in this part of the world. Parks Canada's Species at Risk program team has worked really closely with the Songhees and Esquimalt knowledge keepers in order to restore this ecosystem. And there's a beautiful carved welcome gate at the garden entrance, which marks this as an important Indigenous place. And the interpretive signage helps visitors learn about the different seasons in the meadow and also how Indigenous people use and cultivate the plants that grow here. In particular, the camas bulb is one that we think of a lot when we think of a Gary Oak Learning Meadow, because it's a beautiful blue bloom that we see in the springtime. But the camas bulb is just one of the species that was and continues to be really culturally significant to the Kwanghan-speaking people.
Just to clarify for listeners who might not know, we're talking about the Gary Oak Learning Meadow you just explained. That's Garryoak, Gary Oak. And I looked it up and I understand that the Gary Oak species is the only native oak species in Western Canada. So I learned something.
Yeah, they're hard to miss when you come to Victoria. It's a beautiful tree that it's quite gnarly and it has a very specific look to it.
Yeah, I love oak trees in general. And I remember the beautiful trees when I was visiting there. Another thing I remember is that I saw hummingbirds on the walk.
For sure. Yeah, you could definitely come across some hummingbirds. There's a lot of species that make their home at Fort Rod Hill, actually, and Fisgard Lighthouse. Black-tailed deer is really common to see. And there's no missing the Canada geese. There are many, many Canada geese on site.
We have them here too. Yeah.
But you might see seals, eagles, shorebirds. Like every time I go for a walk on site, I see something new. So
I remember, I think it was 3 hummingbirds flying around, kind of hovering around near me. That was pretty cool.
Were you wearing a red hat?
Was I wearing a red hat? I don't think so. I usually wear a baseball cap, but not usually red. I'm not sure what I was wearing. But there's also a nature trail on the site.
Yeah, the historic nature trail also references the use of the land before the lighthouse or the fort were built. So it's part of a larger system of trails used by the local Indigenous people historically. And now the trail is a beautiful walk through a forested area of the site. It leads visitors out to 2 of the searchlights that were part of the coastal defense system. And along the trail, there's some really great signage, interactive signage that shares information about the local plants and animals that make their homes at Fort Rod Hill.
So let's talk about the lighthouse just a little bit more. First of all, are there any preservation projects that have been carried out at the lighthouse in recent years?
For sure. Preservation of the lighthouse has been really an ongoing project almost since it was built, as we learned from Bevis's correspondence we talked about earlier. But when the lighthouse became fully automated in early 1929, it no longer had a lightkeeper living there. And so it became a bit of a popular spot for vandalism. And so it's needed some work in that regard. It also had a fire in 1957, which damaged most of the interior finishings. And so since 1960, when Parks Canada became involved in the site, the exterior of the lighthouse has been restored to what it looked like around 1873. Really, the interior after 2010 with the installation of the exhibits, that was a fairly major more recent project that provided, the intent was to provide better access to visitors to the interior of the lighthouse and tell more stories about the site and its keepers. So that was a big interior restoration project.
Yeah. Are there any further preservation projects, restoration projects in the pipeline?
Yes, there's always the need to protect the exterior of the building from the elements. So it's kind of a constant concern. And there are plans in the works to do some more work on the exterior. In general, the roof, the masonry, the paint, the bricks all require regular upkeep in order to keep the building waterproof. So really not much has changed since William Bevis's experience in the 1860s.
Yeah. Do you have any special events at the lighthouse and or at the fort?
Yeah, for sure. From May to October, interpretive staff are on site and they offer a range of activities every day for the public to participate in. It might be doing something like some of the chores the lightkeeper would have had to do in the 1800s, or learning about medical equipment that was used in World War I, wartime military training drills, or even offering ice cream in the canteen. So there's sort of a range of activities that people can participate in. The site also offers large public events. Historically, these have included Canada Day, a really big community Canada Day on July 1st, and also historical weapons demonstrations and reenactments and other large community events. So we're still finalizing the events for this summer, but they will be posted on our website. So if anyone's planning a trip, best to check out the website to see if there are any events scheduled before you head this way. But one of the things that's actually really popular right now is the opportunity to camp overnight at the fort. And we have 5 canvas tents that are furnished and can sleep 6 people. So it's really perfect opportunity for families or a group that want to have an extended visit and a particularly memorable visit to the site, because it gives you the chance to explore the site after hours and really imagine what it might have been like to live full time at the lighthouse or to spend summer in military training at the fort.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. What a great opportunity for families. It's always so cool being at a lighthouse at night in terms of its nature too, just being in a beautiful place like that overnight.
I agree. When it's quiet and closed to visitors, so you really get a sense of being able to explore it at your own pace and find what interests you. I think it's a neat opportunity.
Oh, definitely. So would you say, I think I know what your answer will be for this, but would you say that Fisgard Lighthouse is an important historic monument for the Victoria area and for BC on the whole?
Yeah, for sure. I hope that I've shared some reasons that you'll believe me when I say I think Fort Fisgard Lighthouse and Fort Rod Hill are both important sites, both locally and nationally.
Oh, definitely. There's no doubt about it. I have one final question for you, okay? And this one's for bonus points. So get your number 2 pencil ready and sharpened.
Okay.
What is your favorite thing about working at the Fort Rod Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse National Historic Site?
Oh my goodness. What I love the most is the range of stories. There's an incredible depth of history here. It's such a surprise. I think people might be drawn to the site because of the lighthouse, and I think a lot of people are, but then they get here and there's so much more here. It's not just the stories of Canada's recent past. The site celebrates human interactions with this land that stretches back thousands of years, and the natural beauty of the site as well is stunning. So it's really incredible to get to know just the depth of history in the site. My job is endlessly interesting because I get to explore all of those stories and share those stories with our visitors. It's really a special place.
Well, that's nicely summed up. And I completely agree about the beauty of the place and the tremendous history. And it's really great speaking with you today, Shannon. Nice meeting you via Zoom. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. And all this talk about that place and about British Columbia in general makes me want to go back. I loved Victoria, just the city of Victoria. It was a great city to visit. I had such a nice time there. One of these years, maybe I'll see you there in person.
Come say hi.
Yeah, I hope so. I really hope so. So again, thank you so much for spending this time with me today, Shannon. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was great.
You can learn more about Fisgard Lighthouse and Fort Rod Hill on the Parks Canada website at pc.gc.ca. There's also an excellent book on Fisgard and other lighthouses in the area. It's called To the Lighthouse, An Explorer's Guide to the Lighthouses of Southwestern BC by Peter Johnson, John Walls, and photographer Richard Paddle.
Yeah, it's a great book. We had John Walls, the co-author, on this podcast not too long ago. I visited Fisgard Lighthouse, as I talked about with Shannon in the interview, back in 2015. I really loved it. Anyone going to British Columbia needs to go there, and I also recommend spending time in the city of Victoria, which I think is one of the most beautiful cities I've seen.
Thanks as always to all the members, volunteers, and staff of the U.S. Lighthouse Society. Check out uslhs.org to learn more about tours, the Passport Program, preservation grants, and everything else the Society has to offer.
If you listen to this podcast using Apple Podcasts or any platform that lets you post reviews, please rate and review us.
The author Roy T. Bennett wrote in his book, The Light in the Heart, quote, "Each day brings new opportunities, allowing you to constantly live with love, be there for others, bring a little light into someone's day, be grateful, and live each day to the fullest," end quote.
On next week's episode of Lighthearted, we'll be talking with Pam Setchell and Michelle Miroff of the Huntington Lighthouse Preservation Society in New York. As always, thanks so much for listening, and
keep a good light.